July 2011. The air in Cedar Creek, Oregon was thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket of summer heat that made the asphalt soft and the cicadas buzz with a frantic energy. On a forgotten side street, lined with aging oak trees whose roots had buckled the sidewalk, a small public works crew was methodically erasing the past. Their task for the day was simple: remove old street furniture, relics of a time before municipal budget cuts and modernization. Among the targets was a solitary, rusted-out mail collection box, its blue paint peeling away to reveal a cancerous spread of orange-brown decay. For nearly 2 decades it had stood as a silent, ignored sentinel, a forgotten piece of a system that had long since been rerouted, its purpose lost to time and neglect. Dave, a man whose face was etched with the lines of 1,000 mundane workdays, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. To him, the collection box was just another item on a long list, another piece of scrap metal destined for the crusher. He hefted his sledgehammer, the polished wood of the handle worn smooth from years of use, its weight a familiar comfort in his grasp. The sun beat down on his neck as he positioned himself, his boots crunching on the dry, sun-scorched grass that grew around the box's concrete base. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and hot metal, and saw only a job to be finished before lunch, a simple act of demolition with no more significance than pulling a weed. He swung the hammer in a wide, powerful arc. The impact was a dull, metallic clang that echoed briefly in the sleepy afternoon quiet, a sound of brute force meeting stubborn resistance. A cloud of red rust dust puffed into the air, momentarily catching the sunlight before settling back onto the scorched ground. The box shuddered on its post but held firm, its door dented but its secrets still locked away inside. It was as if the years of neglect had fused it shut, a metal tomb determined to keep its contents hidden from the world. Dave grunted, annoyed at the object's resilience, and repositioned himself for another, more determined strike, his muscles tensing for the effort. The second swing was delivered with the full force of his frustration. This time, the sound was a sharp crack followed by a tortured screech of metal. The rusted hinge, the box's final line of defense, snapped. The small deposit door, bent and misshapen from the blow, swung violently open, hanging crookedly and exposing the dark, musty interior to the daylight for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. A cascade of dried leaves, brittle insect husks, and thick cobwebs spilled out onto the sidewalk, a miniature avalanche of decay. For a moment, that was all there seemed to be, the detritus of years of silent, undisturbed emptiness, a hollow shell that had outlived its usefulness. Peering inside, Dave's eyes adjusted to the gloom. He was about to turn away, satisfied the job was done, when he saw it. Tucked in a corner, partially buried beneath the organic debris, was a small, pale rectangle. It was an envelope, its paper stained a sickly brown and warped by countless seasons of damp Oregon winters and humid summers. It looked more like a flattened piece of fungus than something man-made, its edges soft and decomposed. The ink of the address was a blurry, unreadable watercolor smudge, a ghost of a message that had failed to reach its destination. It was almost trash, but its distinct shape, its inherent purpose, held his gaze. He hesitated for a second, then reached into the dark, grimy space. His fingers, thick and calloused, carefully pinched a corner of the envelope. It was surprisingly delicate, the paper feeling like damp cloth, threatening to disintegrate at the slightest pressure. He pulled it out into the harsh sunlight. There was no stamp, just the faint, ghostly lines of what might have been a name, a street, a life. His job was to clear away the junk, to haul it to the dump. But this felt different. This wasn't a piece of public property. It was a piece of someone's story. With a sigh, he carefully slipped the fragile, forgotten letter into the pocket of his dusty work jeans. 18 years. For 18 years, that letter had waited inside its metal prison. A silent witness to the changing seasons and the town that had moved on around it. It was placed there on a morning of torrential rain, November 15, 1993, by a man who would never come home for dinner. Frank Miller, the town mail carrier, a man known for his reliable smile and the steady rhythm of his daily route, had vanished. The initial investigation was brief, colored by the assumption of a man simply escaping a life he no longer wanted. Within a year, the case was unofficially closed, filed away under the cold, sterile label of, quote, family abandonment. The town of Cedar Creek accepted this narrative with a quiet, collective sigh of relief. It was a simpler, cleaner story than the alternatives. A man leaving was a personal tragedy. Anything else was a community wound. So the story stuck. Frank Miller was the man who walked away, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. But for his 10-year-old daughter Sarah and the rest of his family, that story was a lie, a comfortable fiction that allowed everyone else to forget. For them, his disappearance was not a closed chapter, but a gaping hole, a constant, aching void, filled only with unanswered questions, and the ghost of a man they refused to believe would ever leave them. That fragile, water-damaged envelope now resting in Dave's pocket was more than just a lost piece of mail. It was a time capsule, a key forged in the past and delivered by chance. It held no knowledge of the pain it had caused, no awareness of the lives it had irrevocably altered, but its discovery was a tremor, the first sign of a foundational lie about to crack wide open. 18 years after an entire town assumed their mail carrier had simply walked away, a damp envelope, rescued from oblivion by a sledgehammer, was about to scream the truth. In Portland, the hum of the city was a constant, predictable rhythm. For Sarah Miller, a 28-year-old attorney, that predictability was a shield. Her office, high in a glass tower, offered a panoramic view of a world built on logic, contracts, and consequences, a world far removed from the murky uncertainty that had defined her childhood. She had meticulously constructed a life of order to keep the chaos of the past at bay, but the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. When her phone buzzed, displaying an unfamiliar number with the Cedar Creek area code, a cold knot formed in her stomach. It was a phantom limb aching, a call from a place she had tried to surgically remove from her life. With a deep breath, she answered, her professional calm a fragile veneer over a wound that had never truly healed. The voice on the other end was young, female, and official, Deputy Chloe Evans. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the words that followed shattered the carefully controlled silence of her office. Ms. Miller, it's about your father, Frank Miller. Sarah's hand went numb, her pen clattering onto the polished surface of her desk. The sound was unnaturally loud. 18 years of practiced composure dissolved in a single, heart-stopping moment. The city outside her window blurred into an indistinct smear of gray and steel. All that existed was the deputy's voice, a conduit reaching across nearly 2 decades of silence, promising to drag her back into the very heart of the mystery that had broken her family and stolen her innocence. The world tilted on its axis, and the ghost she had lived with her entire life suddenly felt terrifyingly real and present. Deputy Evans spoke with a cautious professionalism, explaining the bizarre circumstances of the discovery. A rusted collection box, a public works crew, a single, water-damaged letter. To Sarah, the story sounded like a fever dream, an impossible sequence of events that couldn't possibly be real. Her mind, trained to find logic and precedent, rebelled against the absurdity of it all. A letter? After all this time? It felt like a cruel cosmic joke. She pictured the forgotten metal box, standing silent through 18 winters, 18 summers, holding on to its secret, while her family disintegrated under the weight of not knowing. The object itself was an indictment of the town's collective amnesia, a physical manifestation of the unresolved grief that had festered in her heart since she was a little girl. The initial shock quickly curdled into a familiar cold fury. It was the same anger she had felt as a 10-year-old, trying to convince skeptical adults that her father would never, ever leave them. It was the anger of watching her mother fade into a shadow of her former self. It was the anger at every neighbor who offered pitying glances, but accepted the official story of family abandonment because it was easier, cleaner, and required nothing of them. This letter wasn't just a clue. It was a vindication. It was proof that something had been missed, that the story wasn't over. It was the first tangible piece of evidence in 18 years that affirmed what she had always known in her gut. Her father didn't walk away. He was taken. Her lawyer's mind snapped into focus, a shield against the overwhelming wave of emotion. Have you opened it? What does it say? Who was it addressed to? The questions were sharp, precise, fired off like bullets. She needed facts, data points to anchor herself in the swirling chaos of her rekindled trauma. Deputy Evans' voice remained steady on the other end of the line, explaining that the envelope was too fragile to be handled without care and was being sent to the State Police Forensics Lab. The deputy confirmed the case, officially dormant for 17 years, was now active. An active investigation. The words resonated in the sterile quiet of Sarah's office. It meant that for the first time since 1993, someone else was finally asking the same questions she had been screaming into the void for her entire adult life. When the call ended, Sarah stood motionless, the receiver still pressed to her ear as if it might offer more answers. The silence that descended was heavier than before, filled with the ghosts of unspoken possibilities. She turned her gaze to a small, silver frame on the corner of her desk. In it, a photo of her as a 10-year-old girl, perched on her father's shoulders, both of them beaming with unrestrained joy. For years, that picture had been a source of quiet pain, a memory of a perfect moment before the world fell apart. Now, it was a mandate. The smiling man in the photo deserved justice. The little girl deserved the truth. Her life in Portland, her career, her carefully constructed peace, it all felt like a temporary distraction. Her real work was back in Cedar Creek. The drive east from Portland was a journey through time. The sleek cityscape gave way to the dense, dripping forests of the Oregon countryside. Each mile closer to Cedar Creek felt like a step deeper into a past she had desperately tried to outrun. The familiar curve of the road, the towering Douglas firs draped in moss, the relentless gray sky. It was all a prelude to the pain she knew was waiting. This wasn't a homecoming. It was an exhumation. She wasn't just returning to a place, but to a feeling. The suffocating helplessness of being a child whose world had vanished overnight. The town, once the backdrop of a happy childhood, now seemed sinister, its quaint storefronts and quiet streets hiding a dark secret that had been allowed to fester for far too long. She pulled into the driveway of the house she grew up in, a place frozen in time. Her mother, Helen, stood silhouetted in the doorway, her frame smaller, more fragile than Sarah remembered. The news had already reached her. In her mother's eyes, Sarah saw a dangerous flicker of hope, an emotion so long dormant it was almost unrecognizable. It was mixed with a profound, bone-deep fear of having old wounds ripped open again. Seeing that vulnerability transformed Sarah's purpose. This was no longer just about her own need for answers. It was about fighting for her mother, for the woman who had endured 18 years of whispers and suspicion with quiet dignity. She was no longer just Frank Miller's daughter. She was his champion, his voice, his final defense. The promise of the letter hung in the air between them, an unspoken vow. This was more than just a piece of paper. It was a catalyst, a key that could unlock the truth that had been sealed away for nearly 2 decades. Sarah knew this path would be agonizing. It meant confronting the people who had turned their backs on her family, digging into the town's carefully constructed narrative, and facing the monster who had taken her father. But for the first time, there was a direction, a tangible starting point. The letter was a thread. Her mission was to pull on it, no matter how hard it resisted, until the entire tapestry of lies unraveled completely. The implicit promise was clear. The truth was finally within reach, and she would tear the town apart to get it. Her first stop was the Clackamas County Sheriff's Station in Cedar Creek, a small brick building that smelled of stale coffee and damp paperwork. Inside, she met Deputy Chloe Evans. The deputy was younger than Sarah had expected, with a sharp, intelligent gaze that held no trace of the weary indifference that had characterized the original investigators. As Chloe laid out the few known facts, Sarah saw a kindred spirit, another woman unwilling to let a man's life be reduced to a cold case file number. An unspoken alliance formed in that cramped, poorly lit office. It was the two of them against the town's long-held silence, against the inertia of time, against a killer who had walked free for 18 years. Finally, Chloe slid a large evidence bag across the desk. Inside lay the letter. It was a pathetic, fragile thing, stained brown and warped into an almost unrecognizable shape. The paper looked as thin as a dead leaf, the ink a faded, watery blur. Yet, this frail object held more power than anything in Sarah's life. It was her father's last message, a voice from the grave that had finally found its way to the surface. As she stared at it, the weight of 18 years of questions pressed down on her. What secret did her father write down on that rainy November morning? What was he trying to warn someone about? And who was willing to commit murder to ensure this very letter was never, ever delivered? Before the discovery, before the letter became a relic screaming for justice, there was Cedar Creek in the fall of 1993. The town was a postcard of Pacific Northwest life, nestled in a valley where the scent of damp earth and pine needles was a constant perfume. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the logging trucks that rumbled through Main Street and the salmon runs in the creek that gave the town its name. It was a place where doors were rarely locked and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over weathered picket fences. The persistent Oregon drizzle was not a nuisance, but a comforting blanket, washing the world clean and nurturing the lush, almost aggressive greenery that threatened to reclaim any patch of unattended land. It was a community that believed in its own quiet goodness, a safe harbor from the complexities of the outside world, completely unaware of the darkness festering just beneath its tranquil surface. At the heart of this idyllic picture was the Miller family. Their small, two-story house on Chestnut Lane was a beacon of warmth and stability. Frank Miller was the center of their universe, a man whose laughter was as reliable as his daily mail route. He was the kind of father who taught his daughter, 10-year-old Sarah, how to ride a bike on a sunny afternoon and how to find constellations in the clear night sky. His wife, Helen, was the quiet anchor, a woman whose love was expressed in warm meals and the gentle hum of a sewing machine. Their life was a tapestry woven from simple, predictable threads, family dinners, weekend fishing trips, and the comforting ritual of Frank reading a bedtime story to Sarah every single night. It was an ordinary, beautiful life, one they believed was unbreakable, forged in the kind of unassuming love that felt eternal and absolute. Frank's presence extended far beyond his own front door. He was a vital part of the town's daily rhythm. As the local mail carrier, he was more than a civil servant. He was a confidant, a messenger, and a familiar face who connected the disparate lives of Cedar Creek. He knew who was expecting a letter from a grandchild, who was struggling with medical bills, and whose dog would greet him with a wagging tail or a suspicious bark. He carried dog treats in his pockets and always had a moment for a brief chat, his easy smile, a small but consistent source of light in people's day. In a town built on familiarity, Frank Miller was a cornerstone. His disappearance wouldn't just be a family tragedy, it would be a tear in the very fabric of the community, a disruption to the predictable and safe world they all took for granted. Working alongside him, though never truly with him, was Arthur Bishop. In 1993, Arthur was a quiet, unassuming man in his 40s, easily lost in the background. While Frank was gregarious and well-loved, Arthur was his opposite, reserved, efficient, and socially invisible. He did his job with a clipped precision that bordered on detachment, rarely engaging in the casual camaraderie of the post office break room. Colleagues saw him as a loner, perhaps a bit resentful of Frank's natural popularity, but no one saw him as a threat. Their dynamic was one of quiet contrast, a professional rivalry so subtle it was barely perceptible. Frank occasionally mentioned Arthur's habit of cutting corners, but dismissed it as professional jealousy. No one could have imagined that behind Arthur's bland facade was a cold, calculating mind capable of unimaginable violence to protect a hidden, illicit enterprise. The morning of November 15, 1993, began like any other under the oppressive weight of a sky that had opened up in a relentless torrential downpour. The sound of rain drumming against the roof was the soundtrack to the Miller family's morning routine. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, watching her father in his familiar blue uniform, the smell of his coffee mingling with the sweet aroma of her mother's pancakes. He kissed Helen, then knelt to hug Sarah, his jacket cool and damp against her cheek. "I'll be home for dinner, sweetie," he promised, his voice a warm, comforting rumble. "Don't let the rain wash you away." She watched him walk out the door, his mail satchel slung over his shoulder, and disappear into the gray, weeping world. It was a perfectly ordinary goodbye, a moment so mundane she would later have to fight to remember its every detail, unaware it was the last time she would ever see him. As dusk fell, the relentless rain continued its assault, and a cold knot of anxiety began to form in Helen's stomach. Frank was never late. Punctuality was a point of pride for him, a core part of his very being. The first call to the post office was met with casual reassurance. He probably got held up by the storm. But as the hours bled into one another, turning the gray afternoon into a black, stormy night, Helen's anxiety morphed into raw, visceral fear. The house felt unnervingly empty without the sound of his key in the lock. Sarah, sensing her mother's terror, sat silently on the stairs, clutching a teddy bear. By the time Helen made the frantic call to the sheriff's department, the rain outside was a raging tempest, a perfect mirror for the storm of panic that had engulfed their once safe home, washing away all sense of normalcy forever. The initial investigation was a study in small-town indifference. The sheriff, a man nearing retirement, viewed the case through a lens of weary cynicism. To him, Frank Miller was just another man with a mortgage, a wife, and a routine, a prime candidate for someone who simply snapped and walked away from it all. The theory of family abandonment was floated almost immediately, a convenient narrative that required minimal effort. Frank and Helen's accounts of a happy marriage were dismissed as naive. Sarah's tearful insistence that her daddy would never leave them was treated as the predictable denial of a child. The search for his mail truck was perfunctory, and when it was found abandoned on a remote service road, the conclusion was swift. He had hitched a ride and started a new life, leaving his old one behind on the side of a muddy road. This simple, cruel explanation spread through Cedar Creek like a virus, infecting the town's collective consciousness. It was an easier truth to swallow than the alternative. A man leaving his family was a private shame, a personal tragedy. A man being harmed, murdered, suggested a danger that could touch anyone, a serpent in their idyllic garden. And so, the community chose the simpler story. Pitying glances replaced casserole dishes on the Millers' doorstep. Whispers followed Helen in the grocery store. The family's grief was compounded by a profound sense of betrayal as they were left to navigate their nightmare alone. The town that Frank had served so faithfully turned its back on his memory, allowing a comfortable lie to take root and fester, burying the terrible truth for nearly 2 decades, under a heavy shroud of willful ignorance and collective silence. The psychology of Cedar Creek in 1993 was one of deliberate, almost stubborn insularity. It was a community that prided itself on self-reliance, a trait forged by generations of loggers and mill workers who depended on each other and viewed outsiders with a healthy dose of suspicion. There was an unspoken social contract. You don't pry into your neighbor's business, and they won't pry into yours. This created a facade of harmony, but it was a harmony built on silence. This collective tendency to look the other way was the fertile ground in which the lie about Frank Miller's abandonment would so easily take root. The town was already grappling with the slow decline of the timber industry, a quiet, economic rot that left many feeling anxious and insecure. They didn't want more trouble. They wanted peace, even if it was a peace built on a convenient fiction. The Cedar Creek post office was a microcosm of the town itself, a place governed by routine, seniority, and the slow, steady rhythm of the mail. It was a world of sorting machines, rubber stamps, and the familiar scent of ink and paper. Here, the contrast between Frank Miller and Arthur Bishop was most apparent. For Frank, the job was a public service, a daily mission to connect people. He saw faces and stories behind the addresses on the envelopes. For Arthur, it was purely a system of logistics, a network of routes and schedules to be navigated with cold efficiency. He viewed Frank's friendly chats and personal touches as a waste of time, a professional weakness. The friction between them was subtle, manifesting in small disagreements over procedure that Frank would dismiss with a laugh, but which Arthur would catalog as evidence of Frank's incompetence and his own superiority. Arthur Bishop was a man who perfected the art of being unseen. He lived in a modest, immaculately kept house on the edge of town, a place as nondescript as he was. His lawn was always edged with military precision, his windows were always spotless, and he was never seen without his shirt tucked in. This obsession with external order was a carefully constructed shield, hiding the deep-seated chaos of his illicit activities. To his colleagues and neighbors, he was simply Quiet Arthur, a man who kept to himself, perhaps a little strange, but ultimately harmless. He was a social ghost, gliding through the town's periphery without leaving a trace. This very invisibility was his greatest asset, allowing him to operate in the shadows while hiding in plain sight. No one suspected him of anything sinister, because, to them, he was barely there at all. Beneath the placid surface of Cedar Creek, a hidden current of criminality was flowing. It wasn't a vast, organized syndicate, but a small, opportunistic network specializing in smuggling high-value stolen goods and untaxed firearms. Arthur Bishop was its logistical linchpin, using the intricate and trusted network of the United States Postal Service as his personal delivery system. He exploited blind spots in the sorting and delivery process, redirecting specific packages to dead-drop locations or to accomplices along his route. Frank Miller, with his unwavering integrity and meticulous attention to detail, was a threat he hadn't anticipated. Frank was the kind of man who would notice a recurring, oddly weighted parcel or a shipping label that didn't quite look right. He was an honest man in a system being corrupted, and that honesty made him a dangerous liability. For Helen Miller, the world before November 1993 was one of simple, profound contentment. Her life was anchored by her love for Frank and Sarah, a love that was steady, reliable, and as comforting as the morning sun. Her days were a tapestry of familiar routines, tending to her rose garden, whose blooms were the envy of the neighborhood, volunteering at the local library, sharing her love of stories with the town's children, and most importantly, waiting for the sound of Frank's mail truck turning onto their street at the end of the day. Their partnership was one of quiet understanding and mutual respect. Frank was the outgoing, social center of their family, while Helen was the calm, nurturing heart. The life they had built together was her sanctuary, a world of warmth and safety she believed was impervious to the darkness that lay just beyond their white picket fence. To 10-year-old Sarah, her father was a giant, a local celebrity who commanded smiles and waves wherever he went. Her world was a safe and magical place, and he was its primary architect. She saw his job not as a mundane chore, but as an epic daily adventure. He was the keeper of secrets, the bearer of news, the man who made the whole town run. Her memories were painted in the sensory details of his presence, the crisp, clean smell of his blue uniform, the comforting weight of his hand on her shoulder, the jingle of his keys as he walked up the front steps, and the deep, rumbling sound of his voice as he read her a bedtime story every single night without fail. He was the sun her small universe revolved around. His disappearance wasn't just the loss of a parent. It was the collapse of reality itself, the extinguishing of the light that made her feel safe in the world. Frank's downfall was a direct result of his greatest virtue, his unshakable integrity. He had started to notice small but persistent irregularities, packages that seemed to vanish from the system, manifests that didn't align with the cargo, and Arthur Bishop's increasingly secretive and defensive behavior. He likely mentioned his concerns to Helen in passing, dismissing them as a simple case of a coworker cutting corners, something he intended to handle, quote, by the book. He believed in the institution he served and trusted that filing a formal complaint would trigger a proper, internal investigation. He saw it as his duty as a federal employee. On that rainy November morning, as he wrote out his concerns on a piece of paper, he had no idea he was not just reporting a crime, but confronting a killer. He thought he was fixing a problem, never imagining he was signing his own death warrant. The final, fatal piece of the puzzle clicked into place just a week before he vanished. It was a mundane moment in the post office sorting room. Frank, ever observant, picked up a package destined for a remote address on Arthur's route and commented on its unusual weight and shoddy labeling. "Looks like someone's mailing a box of rocks, Art," he said with a good-natured chuckle. Arthur didn't laugh. He simply took the package, his expression unreadable, and replied with a cold, flat tone, "Just do your job, Frank, and I'll do mine." Frank shrugged it off as Arthur's usual gruffness. But in that moment, Arthur knew he had been seen. Frank's casual observation wasn't an accusation, but for a man with so much to hide, it was a threat. The clock had started ticking. The town's comforting tranquility had just been given a deadline. The wait was an agony of suspended time. Days bled into a week, then 2, as the fragile, water-damaged letter made its journey to the Oregon State Police Forensics Lab in Salem. For Sarah, each passing hour was a battle between the hope that had been so violently reawakened and the familiar, cynical despair that had been her companion for 18 years. She spent most of her time in a haze at her mother's house, the silence thick with unspoken questions. She would sit with Deputy Chloe Evans in the small, cramped office at the sheriff's station, the two of them poring over the original 1993 case file, a thin, pathetic collection of dismissive notes and dead-end leads. The letter was their only real anchor, a physical object promising a truth that felt both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. Every ring of the phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah, a Pavlovian response to a bell that might finally end her life's longest and most painful question. The call finally came on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside a flat, oppressive gray. Deputy Evans answered on the second ring, her voice a mask of professionalism. "Evans," she said, her eyes fixed on Sarah. As she listened, her expression remained maddeningly neutral, but Sarah noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her grip on the pen in her hand became a white-knuckled fist. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thin and heavy. Sarah could hear the faint, tinny squawk of the voice on the other end of the line, but the words were an indecipherable code. She watched Chloe's face for any flicker of emotion, a raised eyebrow, a slight nod, anything that would betray the contents of the conversation. It was a silent, excruciating performance, a one-sided dialogue that held the key to her entire past, and all she could do was watch, wait, and try not to break under the immense weight of the moment. Chloe carefully placed the receiver back in its cradle, the click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. She took a slow, deliberate breath before turning to face Sarah. "Okay," she began, her voice low and steady. They confirmed it. "The ink has bled significantly, and the paper's cellulose is severely degraded, but they were able to use comparative analysis on the few intact fibers." She paused, letting the technical jargon hang in the air for a second before delivering the first, crucial piece of information. "The handwriting is a definitive match to your father's signature on his federal employment forms. There is no doubt, Sarah. Frank Miller wrote that letter." The words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. It was real. It was his. For the first time in 18 years, she had a tangible piece of her father, a final message he had tried to send, and the validation was so overwhelming it almost brought her to her knees. The forensic team, Chloe explained, had worked miracles. Using advanced imaging techniques, including infrared and ultraviolet light scans, they had managed to painstakingly reconstruct fragments of the text that were invisible to the naked eye. The water damage had acted like a cruel censor, erasing entire sentences but leaving behind a ghostly skeleton of intent. They isolated several key phrases, Chloe said, sliding a freshly printed sheet of paper across the desk. On it were typed the words the lab had managed to salvage. The first one Sarah's eyes landed on was formal complaint. Her legal training immediately kicked in, processing the significance. This wasn't a personal note or a cry for help. It was an official act. Her father was using the proper channels, documenting a wrongdoing he had observed as a dedicated employee of the United States Postal Service. He was following the rules, just as he always had. Then came the next fragments, and the world tilted on its axis. The second legible piece of text was a name, Arthur Bishop. The name was a ghost from her childhood, a vague memory of a quiet, mousy man who sometimes worked at the post office, a man Frank had occasionally mentioned with a sigh of frustration. He was a background character, a piece of scenery in the story of her father's life, but now his name was at the very center of its end. And then, the final word the lab had been able to recover, the one that tied everything together into a knot of cold, terrifying certainty. Smuggling. Smuggling. Arthur Bishop. Smuggling. The words formed a brutal, undeniable narrative. Her father hadn't just stumbled upon a coworker cutting corners. He had discovered a serious crime, and he was about to expose it. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over Sarah, eclipsing the grief that had been her constant companion. For 18 years, the town had whispered that her father was a coward, a man who had abandoned his family. The truth was the exact opposite. He was a hero. He was a man of integrity who had confronted a dangerous secret head-on, armed with nothing but a pen and his belief in the system he served. The official story of family abandonment was not just a mistake, it was a desecration of his memory, a comfortable lie that had allowed a criminal to walk free while her family suffered under a cloud of shame and suspicion. The pain of his absence was now compounded by the rage of this profound injustice. He hadn't run away from them, he had been silenced because he refused to look the other way. From an investigative standpoint, the letter changed everything. Deputy Evans looked at the thin, dusty file folder labeled Miller, Frank, Missing Person, and knew it was obsolete. "This is no longer a missing person case, Sarah," she stated, her tone shifting from one of cautious inquiry to one of grim purpose. "This is now a homicide investigation. The letter provides probable cause. Your father was reporting a federal crime, and the primary subject of that complaint, Arthur Bishop, is now our primary suspect in his disappearance and probable murder." The words hung in the air, both terrifying and validating. It meant new resources from the county and state, a new level of scrutiny, and the legal authority to pursue leads that had been ignored for nearly 2 decades. The town's long, sleepy silence was about to be shattered by the full force of the law. The path forward was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Arthur Bishop. He was still here, living just a few miles away in the same modest house he'd occupied for over 30 years, a respected retiree, a quiet neighbor. He had spent the last 18 years hiding in plain sight, protected by a lie the town had been all too willing to accept. He had watched Sarah grow up from a distance, had seen Helen's grief in the grocery store, and had remained silent, a predator camouflaged as a harmless old man. The initial discovery had answered the question of what her father was doing on his final day. But now, it opened a far more sinister and urgent line of inquiry. What did Arthur Bishop do to Frank Miller after he sealed that envelope, and where had he hidden the evidence of his crime for all these years? The initial strategy session between Sarah and Deputy Evans was held in the stark, fluorescent-lit confines of the sheriff's station, a war room for a battle that had been dormant for 18 years. With the forensic report as their new gospel, Evans began to outline the formidable legal challenges ahead. The letter, she explained with methodical precision, was a powerful lead, a ghost from the past pointing a finger, but it wasn't enough for an arrest or a search warrant. It was a piece of a puzzle, not the whole picture. Their first move had to be calculated and precise. They would need to approach Arthur Bishop, not as a suspect in a murder, but as a former colleague who might be able to help them understand an old workplace dispute. It was a game of psychological chess, and the first move was designed to see how the king would react to the sudden, unexpected pressure on the board. Armed with this new, terrifying clarity, Sarah and Chloe immediately subpoenaed Arthur Bishop's complete employment records from the United States Postal Service archives. The thick manila folder that arrived felt like a historical artifact, its contents smelling of dust and faded ink. They spent hours poring over the documents, searching for any deviation from the norm, any hint of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. But the file was a monument to mediocrity. Perfect attendance, glowing performance reviews citing his unparalleled efficiency, and not a single disciplinary note. It was the portrait of a man who was meticulously, almost obsessively, average. The only detail that snagged their attention was a small note from 1995. Arthur Bishop had taken early retirement, citing chronic stress and health concerns, just 24 months after Frank Miller vanished. It was a flimsy excuse, a potential crack in the otherwise flawless facade of his unremarkable life. That night, Sarah returned to her childhood home, the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on her. The name Arthur Bishop was no longer an abstract piece of data on a report. It was a living entity, a specter that now haunted every corner of the house. She forced her mind back to 1993, trying to conjure a clear image of him. All she could recall was a thin, gray man who seemed to blend into the background of the post office, a human shadow who rarely spoke and never smiled. She remembered her father coming home one evening, frustrated after a long day, and describing Arthur as the kind of man who would follow the rules right off a cliff. At the time, it was just a fleeting comment, but now it echoed with chilling significance. Arthur wasn't just a quiet coworker. He was a man of rigid, unfeeling procedure, a man for whom rules might be more important than a human life. The next morning, Deputy Evans made the call. Her voice was a masterclass in controlled casualness as she introduced herself to Arthur Bishop and explained she was reviewing some old, unresolved cases from the area. She mentioned Frank Miller's name without any particular emphasis, framing her inquiry as a simple matter of tying up loose ends. On the other end of the line, Arthur's voice was exactly as Sarah remembered it from a distance. Thin, reedy, and devoid of emotion. He listened patiently, his responses clipped and polite. When Evans asked if he would be willing to come to the station to answer a few questions, he agreed without a moment's hesitation. "Of course, Deputy," he said. "Anything I can do to help." His easy compliance was more unnerving than any protest would have been. It was the calm of a man who was absolutely certain his secrets were buried too deep to ever be found. The wait for the interview was an exercise in torment for Sarah. She paced the worn floorboards of her mother's living room, a caged animal trapped between the past and the future. She felt a primal, overwhelming urge to be in that interrogation room, to face the man who had stolen her father and shattered her world. She wanted to see his face when he was confronted with the truth, to watch his carefully constructed world crumble. But Chloe had been firm. Sarah's presence would be inflammatory and legally compromising. Her role was to provide information, to be a resource, not a participant. So she waited, the same passive role she had been forced into since she was 10 years old. The only difference was that this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the promise of a reckoning that was finally, after 18 long years, about to begin. Arthur Bishop arrived at the sheriff's station at precisely 10 a.m., not a minute early or late. He was a man who appeared to have been preserved in amber since 1993. Now in his late 60s, he was still thin, with neatly parted gray hair and a button-down shirt tucked perfectly into pleated trousers. He carried himself with a quiet, unassuming dignity, the very picture of a harmless retiree. Inside the interview room, he sat with his back perfectly straight, his hands folded placidly on the metal table. He answered Deputy Evans' preliminary questions with a calm, almost serene detachment, recounting his years at the post office as a series of mundane routines. When he spoke of Frank, it was with a tone of faint, condescending pity. "Frank was a good man," he said, his voice flat. "A bit too emotional for the job, perhaps. Always getting involved in other people's business." For nearly an hour, Arthur masterfully deflected every question, his narrative a smooth, polished stone, with no cracks for the truth to seep through. He was patient, cooperative, and utterly impenetrable. Deputy Evans let him talk, allowing him to build his fortress of lies, brick by confident brick. Then, in the middle of one of his rambling anecdotes about postal routes, she quietly slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a high-resolution photograph of the recovered letter, the three legible phrases, formal complaint, Arthur Bishop, smuggling, starkly visible against the stained, warped paper. "We found this, Arthur," Evans said, her voice dropping to a low, cold register. "It was in a collection box on the old logging road. Frank Miller wrote it the morning he disappeared. He was reporting you." For a fleeting instant, the mask of the harmless old man vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, cold fury in his eyes. The change was infinitesimal, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, but it was there. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the fingers of his placidly folded hands curled into a tight fist before relaxing again. The air in the room crackled with the sudden, palpable shift in energy. He quickly regained his composure, scoffing with a dismissive wave of his hand. "That's absurd," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "Frank and I had our professional disagreements, nothing more. He was always imagining conspiracies. He denied everything, reverting to his calm, rational persona. But the damage was done. Deputy Evans had seen behind the curtain. She hadn't gotten a confession, but she had gotten something just as valuable. Confirmation. Arthur Bishop was not just a person of interest anymore. He was a liar, and for the first time in 18 years he was afraid. The hunt had officially begun. The interview left a chilling residue in the air, an invisible film of deceit that clung to both Sarah and Deputy Evans long after Arthur Bishop had calmly walked out of the station. His fleeting moment of rage, a crack in his meticulously crafted facade, was the only thing they had. It was a powerful confirmation for their guts, but legally it was nothing. They sat in the sterile office, the case file spread between them like a tarot reading of the past. They knew Arthur was their killer, but he had spent 18 years perfecting his story, burying his crime under layers of mundane life. Chloe leaned back in her chair, the squeak of the vinyl a sharp sound in the tense silence. "His alibi is solid because no one ever tried to break it," she stated, her voice a low, determined hum. "He's counting on us having nothing more than a ghost's words on a dead letter. We need to find someone who saw something, anything, that day." Their strategy shifted from direct confrontation to a meticulous, almost archaeological excavation of the past. They decided to re-interview every single person from the original 1993 witness list, a daunting task that felt like chasing echoes. Sarah insisted on joining Chloe, believing her presence as Frank's daughter might unlock doors that a badge could not. For days, they drove the winding country roads around Cedar Creek, their car a mobile headquarters filled with old maps and faded photographs. The journey was a painful pilgrimage for Sarah, a tour of a town frozen in time, where every familiar face was a potential keeper of a secret. They were met with a frustrating mix of faded memories, nervous evasions, and the deeply ingrained town narrative that Frank Miller was a man who had simply walked away. The wall of silence, built over 18 years, seemed impenetrable. It was a collective amnesia, a defense mechanism the town had adopted to protect its fragile peace. They were on the verge of exhaustion and despair when they arrived at the small, tidy home of Martha Higgins, an 80-year-old woman whose name was a footnote in the original file, dismissed as a neighborhood gossip. Martha, frail but with eyes as sharp as glass shards, listened intently as Chloe explained the new developments. She remembered the torrential rain on November 15, 1993, with the vivid clarity that the elderly often reserve for moments of great upheaval. She spoke of the storm, the wind, the way the creek had swelled. Then, Her gaze shifted to Sarah, a flicker of profound sympathy in her eyes. "Your father was a good man," she said softly. "Always had a kind word. Not like that other one. The quiet one." She paused, her mind sifting through the layers of nearly 2 decades, searching for a detail that had long been dormant, waiting for the right question to bring it to light. Then the memory surfaced. Martha recalled standing at her kitchen window that afternoon, watching the storm rage. She saw a postal vehicle pull up to the secluded collection box at the end of her road, the very same box where the letter was found. She thought it was odd, given the late hour and the severity of the weather, but what truly struck her was the man who got out. It wasn't Frank Miller, with his familiar broad-shouldered gait. It was the other mail carrier, the thin, quiet one, Arthur Bishop. She watched him for a few minutes as he fiddled with the box, his movements quick and furtive, before he got back in his vehicle and sped away. At the time, she dismissed it, assuming he was just securing the box against the storm, but she never forgot it, because that collection box was miles away from Arthur's designated route. It made no sense for him to be there. Martha's testimony was the seismic shock that cracked the foundation of the entire case. It was the first independent piece of evidence that directly contradicted Arthur Bishop's story and placed him at a critical location on the day of the murder. During his interview, Arthur had been adamant. He had finished his own route on the other side of town and gone straight home, claiming he hadn't seen Frank at all that day. Martha's memory, once dismissed as idle gossip, was now the key that unlocked a new, aggressive phase of the investigation. It provided a timeline where Arthur could have intercepted Frank, committed the murder, and then returned to the collection box to retrieve the incriminating letter, not realizing it had already slipped deep inside, hidden from his view. He wasn't helping out. He was tampering with a crime scene, trying to erase his victim's final act. The revelation of Arthur's presence at the collection box prompted Deputy Evans to explore the smuggling allegation with renewed urgency. She made a call to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the federal law enforcement arm of the USPS. Running Arthur Bishop's name and service record through their databases, she connected with a senior inspector in Seattle who remembered whispers of an internal probe in the early 1990s concerning a suspected smuggling ring operating out of rural Oregon post offices. The original investigation had gone cold for lack of an inside source. The inspector explained that the network was believed to be moving high-value stolen camera equipment and untaxed firearms, using the mail system to bypass traditional law enforcement scrutiny. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying speed. Frank hadn't just uncovered a minor infraction. He had stumbled upon a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The federal files painted a grim, detailed picture. The smuggling operation flourished between 1991 and late 1993, with specific parcels of a certain weight and size consistently disappearing from the system, or being rerouted from the Cedar Creek hub. Then, in the winter of 1993, right after Frank Miller vanished, the activity ceased abruptly. The network went dark. 6 months later, Arthur Bishop, a model employee with a spotless record, took an unexpectedly early retirement, citing vague health issues. The timeline was no longer a coincidence. It was a confession written in data. Frank's murder wasn't just about silencing a complaint. It was about protecting a lucrative criminal conspiracy. Arthur Bishop was not a lone wolf. He was the gatekeeper, and Frank Miller was the man who had threatened to lock the gate for good, making him a liability the entire network could not afford. With Martha Higgins's sworn statement and the corroborating intelligence from the Postal Inspection Service, Deputy Evans finally had what she needed. She worked through the night with the county prosecutor, meticulously drafting an affidavit for a search warrant. The document was a damning narrative, weaving together the forensic analysis of the letter, the eyewitness testimony placing Arthur at the scene, and the federal data outlining a criminal conspiracy. It painted Arthur Bishop not as a simple mail carrier, but as a cold, calculating criminal who had committed murder to protect his secrets. The warrant granted them the authority to search not only Arthur's house but the entirety of his property, specifically naming the old, dilapidated tool shed that sat at the far edge of his immaculately kept lawn. The quiet little town of Cedar Creek was about to have its deepest secrets unearthed. The raid was executed at dawn. A convoy of sheriff's vehicles rolled down Arthur Bishop's quiet residential street, the flashing lights washing the pre-dawn gray with strobes of red and blue. Sarah watched from an unmarked car down the block, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. This was it. The culmination of 18 years of waiting, of wondering, of fighting to keep her father's memory alive against a tide of indifference. She saw Arthur appear at his front door, dressed in a robe, his face a mask of confusion that quickly melted into visible, panicked disbelief as Deputy Evans presented him with the warrant. The harmless, quiet retiree persona he had worn for nearly 2 decades dissolved in an instant, replaced by the cornered look of a predator who knows the hunt is finally over. The town's long, comfortable lie was being officially dismantled. The search of the house itself was methodical and initially fruitless. Arthur's home was a sterile museum of a lonely life, obsessively clean and devoid of personal effects. It yielded no clues, no weapons, no trophies. But outside, the real investigation was beginning. A team of forensic technicians, accompanied by 2 specially trained cadaver dogs, began a grid search of the property. The dogs, working with a focused intensity, swept across the manicured lawn before making a hard turn towards the back of the lot. They both zeroed in on the old, weathered shed, its paint peeling and its foundation slowly sinking into the damp Oregon soil. They began to whine, their bodies tense, circling a specific section of the shed's concrete foundation. One of the dogs, a large German shepherd, began to bark furiously, pawing and digging at the soft earth just beside the crumbling concrete slab. A cold certainty settled over the search team. The dogs' reaction was unmistakable. They were alerting to the scent of human decomposition, a scent that can linger in the soil for decades. The forensic team supervisor gave a quiet, firm order. Shovels and excavation tools were brought from the truck. The initial layers of dirt were carefully removed, revealing soil that was darker and more loosely packed than the surrounding earth, a clear sign of a hole that had been dug and refilled long ago. As the team dug deeper, the air grew thick with a heavy, sweet, and sickening odor, the smell of decay and disturbed earth. Deputy Evans knelt at the edge of the growing pit, her face grim. They were no longer searching for evidence of a crime. They were in the process of uncovering the crime itself. Frank Miller was finally about to come home. The first shovelful of dirt that was different, darker, sent a ripple of cold professional urgency through the forensic team. As they dug deeper, the cloying, sweet smell of decay, long dormant, rose from the earth and hung heavy in the damp morning air, a ghost of the violence that had occurred on this very spot. For Sarah, watching from a distance, each scoop of earth felt like a physical blow, an exhumation of her own buried trauma. The hope she had harbored for a different outcome, any outcome other than this, died with each passing second. When the team supervisor finally uncovered a piece of weathered, blue fabric, unmistakably the remnant of a United States Postal Service uniform, a choked sob escaped her lips. The search for a missing man was officially over. The excavation of a grave had just begun. The quiet suburban lawn had transformed into a tomb, and the truth was finally, brutally, clawing its way to the surface. The process of identification was a cold, methodical affair that stood in stark contrast to the raw emotion of the discovery. The skeletal remains were carefully transported to the state medical examiner's office in Portland, where forensic anthropologists and odontologists went to work. They painstakingly compared the skull's dental structures to the detailed records Frank Miller had on file from his last checkup in 1993. The match was definitive. A formal report was issued, its language sterile and detached. The remains recovered from 412 Hemlock Lane, Cedar Creek, are positively identified as those of Frank Miller, male, Caucasian, age 42 at time of death. For Sarah and her mother, Helen, this clinical confirmation was a second death. He stripped away the last desperate fantasy that he might one day walk through the door, replacing it with the unassailable scientific certainty of his murder, a fact now as concrete as the slab he was buried under. The medical examiner's full report was a brutal testament to Frank Miller's final moments. It detailed a series of fractures to the occipital bone, located at the back of the skull. The pattern of the trauma indicated at least 2 severe, high-velocity impacts from a heavy, blunt object, likely with a focused edge, such as the claw end of a hammer or a similar tool. The violence was not the result of a heated argument that escalated. It was decisive, overwhelming, and clearly intended to be fatal. Frank was likely struck from behind, an ambush that left him with no chance to defend himself. This single, horrifying detail completely dismantled any possibility that his death was an accident or a struggle gone wrong. It was an execution, a cold and calculated act of murder committed to silence him with absolute finality, a fact that fueled Sarah's grief with a white-hot, righteous rage. Armed with the irrefutable evidence of a body and a cause of death, Deputy Chloe Evans brought Arthur Bishop back into the sterile confines of the interrogation room. This time there was no pretense of a friendly chat. The man who sat across from her was no longer the calm, collected retiree. He was a cornered animal. His face was pale, his hands trembled slightly, and the placid mask he had worn for 18 years had crumbled, revealing the panicked killer beneath. He began with a series of weak, sputtering denials, but his voice lacked conviction. Evans let him talk, her gaze unwavering, before she slid a series of glossy 8x10 photographs across the table. They showed the excavated grave, the tattered remains of the uniform, and a close-up of the fractured skull. Arthur stared at the images, his breath catching in his throat, the physical proof of his crime staring back at him, erasing his lies one horrifying picture at a time. Under the crushing weight of the evidence, Arthur Bishop's fortress of denial finally collapsed. The confession came not in a torrent, but in a slow, pathetic trickle of self-serving justifications. He claimed it was an accident, a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. He painted a picture of Frank confronting him on a remote service road, accusing him, threatening him. In Arthur's telling, he had simply pushed Frank, who then fell and hit his head on a rock. He insisted he had panicked, burying the body in a moment of fear and confusion. It was a desperate, flimsy narrative, an attempt to reframe a cold-blooded murder as a tragic mishap. He admitted to the act, but stripped it of its motive, hoping to contain the damage and protect the far more dangerous secret that Frank's letter had threatened to expose, the smuggling ring. He was confessing to a lesser crime to hide a greater one. Neither Sarah nor Deputy Evans believed the accident narrative for a second. It was a story riddled with holes, a convenient fiction that completely ignored the central explosive word from Frank's letter, smuggling. A man doesn't accidentally get struck twice in the back of the head with a hammer over a simple workplace argument. The violence was too specific, too final. This realization escalated the entire investigation. The case was no longer just about securing a murder conviction for Arthur Bishop. It was about uncovering the why. Evans knew that the real motive, the secret worth killing for, was buried not in a shallow grave, but in the complex, hidden financial life of a seemingly unremarkable mail carrier. She immediately filed for a new set of warrants, this time targeting every bank account, investment portfolio, and financial transaction Arthur Bishop had made over the last 20 years, determined to follow the money and unearth the real reason Frank Miller had to die. The financial records were a revelation, a Rosetta Stone that translated Arthur's quiet, frugal life into a language of greed and elaborate deception. While his official income was a modest postal worker's salary and pension, his bank accounts showed a pattern of large, regular cash deposits and wire transfers from offshore accounts that began in the early 1990s. The total sum was staggering, amounting to well over $2 million laundered over a decade. He owned properties through shell corporations and had a portfolio of investments that a man on his salary could never have afforded. The money trail was a neon sign pointing directly to a sophisticated, long-running criminal enterprise. Frank Miller hadn't been killed over a professional rivalry. He had been murdered because he was about to disrupt a multi-million-dollar illicit pipeline that ran directly through the heart of the Cedar Creek post office. With the financial evidence as a guide, the investigation exploded in scope. Deputy Evans brought in federal partners from the Postal Inspection Service and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They began to cross-reference the financial data with phone records and shipping manifests from the early 90s. More names began to surface. A senior clerk at the regional sorting facility whose gambling debts suddenly vanished. The owner of a local freight company who co-owned a shell corporation with Arthur. Even a retired town council member who had co-signed on a suspicious real estate deal. The picture that emerged was not of a lone killer, but of a small, tightly knit conspiracy. These were not hardened criminals in the traditional sense, but ordinary, trusted members of the community who had leveraged their positions to create a hidden, lucrative criminal network, all while hiding behind the town's placid, unassuming facade. The details of the smuggling operation were as ingenious as they were audacious. Arthur Bishop, with his intimate knowledge of postal routes and security blind spots, was the logistical mastermind. The network specialized in trafficking high-end stolen goods, shipments of Leica cameras from a Portland warehouse, cases of rare wine, and even untaxed firearms, disguising them as ordinary parcels. Arthur would intercept specific packages, replacing tracking labels and rerouting them to accomplices or dead-drop locations. It was a nearly perfect system, exploiting the one thing no one ever suspected, the integrity of the U.S. mail. Frank Miller, with his unwavering honesty and meticulous attention to detail, was a catastrophic threat to their entire operation. His formal complaint would have triggered a federal audit, and the entire house of cards would have come crashing down. His murder was a calculated business decision to protect their shared secret and their illicit profits. This new, sprawling evidence cast the original 1993 investigation in a deeply sinister light. The initial sheriff's dismissive attitude and the town's quick acceptance of the, quote, family abandonment theory no longer seemed like simple, small-town incompetence. It now hinted at a more profound, deliberate complicity. Had the original investigators been subtly steered away from the truth, were there influential people in town who knew more than they let on, people who benefited from Arthur's network and had a vested interest in seeing the case go cold? Sarah was forced to confront the sickening possibility that the conspiracy wasn't just about smuggling, it was about a town's collective and perhaps corrupt willingness to sacrifice one good man's reputation and his family's peace of mind to protect a dark, profitable secret. The wall of silence she had faced for years was not built on ignorance, but on a foundation of shared guilt. The stakes had been raised to an almost unbearable level. With his accident story in tatters and facing a mountain of financial evidence, Arthur Bishop was presented with a stark choice by the prosecutor. He could take the fall alone for first-degree murder and face life in prison without parole, or he could cooperate, detail the entire smuggling network, name every accomplice, and testify against them in exchange for a lesser charge. The decision he was about to make would determine the fate of several other respected figures in Cedar Creek. For Sarah, the fight was no longer just about her father. It was about dismantling the entire web of lies and corruption that had festered in her hometown for 18 years. The truth about Frank Miller's death was inextricably linked to the very soul of Cedar Creek, and she knew with chilling certainty that the battle for justice had only just begun. The prosecutor's deal hung in the air, a final, inescapable choice for a man whose time had run out. In his holding cell, Arthur Bishop was no longer a man hiding. He was a man trapped, the walls of his own making finally closing in. For Sarah, a legal resolution was not enough. She needed something more primal, a closure that no court could provide. She approached Deputy Evans, her voice low but unyielding, a steel wire of resolve. "I need to see him," she stated, not as a request but as a demand. Evans hesitated, her professional instincts warring with the raw human need she saw in Sarah's eyes. This was against every rule in the book, a dangerous and unpredictable move. But looking at the woman who had clawed her way back through 18 years of lies, Chloe knew this confrontation was the true final act. With a reluctant nod, she agreed to a supervised, recorded meeting. The sterile air of the station crackled with an unspoken energy. This was not about justice anymore, it was about a reckoning. Sarah's walk down the long, sterile corridor to the holding cells was a journey through a tunnel of her own past. The harsh, fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a monotonous buzz, casting long, distorted shadows on the polished concrete floor. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels, each step an echo of the 18 years she had spent walking toward this very moment. The air was thick with the institutional smells of bleach, stale coffee, and a faint, underlying scent of human despair. Through the small wire mesh windows and the heavy steel doors, she caught fleeting glimpses of anonymous faces, men whose stories of ruin were unknown to her. But she ignored them. Her entire world, her entire life's purpose, had narrowed to the single gray, unmarked door at the very end of the hall. Behind it was not just a man, but the answer to the question that had defined her existence. The lock disengaged with a heavy, metallic thud, and the steel door slid open with a jarring, grating screech that scraped against Sarah's raw nerves. There he was. Arthur Bishop sat on the edge of a thin, bare cot, his back to the door, a shrunken figure lost inside a loose-fitting orange jumpsuit. The meticulous, unassuming retiree was gone, replaced by a defeated old man whose posture radiated utter collapse. His gray hair, once so neatly parted, was now a disheveled mess, and his shoulders were slumped in a permanent arch of surrender. For a long moment, he didn't move, as if he were a statue carved from despair. The silence in the small, windowless cell was absolute, a physical weight that seemed to press in from all sides, making it hard to breathe. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, staring at the man who had been the ghost in her life for nearly 2 decades. He turned his head slowly, the movement stiff and pained, as if the muscles in his neck had forgotten how to function. When his eyes finally met Sarah's, she was struck by the profound emptiness within them. The cold fury she had glimpsed during his interrogation was gone, as was the placid mask of the friendly neighbor. All that remained was a vast, hollowed-out landscape of pure, pathetic fear. He looked like a man who had already been judged and condemned, not by a court, but by the ghost of the 10-year-old girl now standing before him as a woman. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a defense or an apology, but the only sound that escaped his lips was a dry, rasping croak, the sound of a voice broken by lies. In that moment, the monster she had imagined for so long dissolved, revealing something far more pitiful, a weak man, utterly consumed by the consequences of his own evil. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was a chilling whisper, sharp and precise enough to slice through the suffocating silence of the cell. Why? The single word hung in the air between them, imbued with the immense gravity of 18 years of pain, of grief, of a life lived in the shadow of a question mark. It was not the question of a lawyer seeking motive for a trial, but the raw, elemental cry of a daughter demanding an explanation for the inexplicable. "He was my father," she continued, her voice gaining strength, each word a carefully aimed dart. "He knew your name. He probably asked you about your weekend. He brought you coffee. He was a good man who thought you were too. So I'm asking you again, why him?" She took a step closer, invading the small pocket of air he occupied, forcing him to face the humanity of the man whose life he had so casually discarded for personal gain. Arthur flinched, his eyes darting around the cell as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. He finally found his voice, a reedy, trembling whisper that was barely audible. He began to recite the pathetic, self-serving narrative he had constructed in his mind, the lies he had told himself for 18 years. "It wasn't personal, you have to understand," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the concrete floor. He found out about the business. He wouldn't listen to reason. He was going to file that report, and he was going to ruin everything, for everyone. He spoke of Frank as if he were an obstacle, a procedural problem that needed to be solved, completely detached from the reality that he was a husband, a friend, and a father. He was confessing not to a murder, but to a cold, heartless business decision, a final insult to the memory of the man he had killed. The calm, controlled facade that Sarah had maintained for weeks finally shattered, unleashing a torrent of pure, incandescent rage. "Ruin everything?" she spat, her voice rising with every word, echoing off the bare concrete walls. "You were a common thief, Arthur!" A petty criminal hiding in a mail carrier's uniform, stealing packages like a rat in a warehouse. My father believed in that uniform. He believed in doing the right thing. He believed this town was safe. You didn't just kill a man. You murdered the very idea that people are decent. You took his life, his future, and you poisoned his memory, all for a box of stolen cameras and a pile of dirty money. Was it worth it? Her words were no longer questions. They were a verdict, a searing indictment of his pathetic, greed-fueled existence, and he had no defense against their truth. Her voice dropped suddenly, becoming a low, menacing whisper that was far more terrifying than her shouting. "I want you to tell me how you did it," she demanded, her eyes boring into his. "Not the sanitized version from the coroner's report. The real version. I want to know if you had the courage to look him in the eye, or if you struck him from behind like the coward I know you are. What did it sound like, Arthur? Tell me. I want you to remember the sound of his skull breaking. Did he cry out? Did he say my mother's name? Did he say mine?" She was forcing him to walk back to that muddy road, to feel the weight of the weapon in his hand, to relive the brutal sensory horror of the act, stripping away his intellectual justifications and leaving him with nothing but the raw, ugly violence he had committed. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, a guttural sob finally breaking free from his chest. The carefully constructed walls he had built around the memory for 18 years crumbled to dust. The words came out in a broken, choked whisper, the confession she had demanded. He described the relentless rain, the argument on the desolate service road, Frank's steadfast refusal to back down. He held up the letter. Arthur rasped, tears now streaming down his face. He said it was his duty. He confessed to grabbing the heavy tire iron from the back of his truck as Frank turned to walk away. From behind, he admitted, the words tasting like poison. He never saw it coming. He just fell. The sound, it was like a branch snapping, and then there was just the rain, washing everything away. The admission was his final, ultimate act of cowardice. And the letter, Sarah pressed, her voice like ice, relentless. "You went back for it. Martha Higgins saw your truck at the collection box that afternoon." Arthur's head snapped up, a flicker of shock in his eyes that a detail so small, so long buried, had come back to haunt him. He nodded numbly, the last piece of his story spilling out. He described his frantic, panicked drive back to the box, his heart pounding in his chest. He pried the rusted door open, the metal groaning in the storm, and plunged his hands into the dark, damp interior. "I couldn't find it," he whispered, his voice filled with the ghost of that long-ago panic. "It was too dark. My hands were shaking. I thought it had gotten stuck, or maybe washed deep inside. I just gave up." His greatest crime was followed by his greatest failure. A single piece of paper he couldn't find, which became the seed of his eventual destruction. Sarah looked at the weeping broken man on the cot, and the volcanic rage that had fueled her for so long began to cool, leaving behind a vast, empty expanse of ice. This wasn't a monster. This was just a small, pathetic man, consumed by greed and cowardice. "You lived your life less than 5 miles from the hole you put him in," she said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion at all. "For 18 years, you went to the grocery store, you collected your pension, You watched me grow from a girl into a woman. You saw my mother's hair turn gray from grief. You lived with our pain every single day, and you stayed silent." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the small cell. "You didn't just bury my father, Arthur. You buried us too. I hope that when you close your eyes at night, his is the only face you see for the rest of your miserable life." Without waiting for a reply, without giving him the satisfaction of a final word, Sarah turned on her heel and walked out of the cell. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to see. The heavy steel doors slid shut behind her with a deafening clang, a sound of absolute finality that echoed down the long corridor. The sound sealed Arthur Bishop's fate, leaving him alone with the ghosts he had created. He was left sobbing on the thin cot, a pathetic, weeping wreck, not for the life he had taken, but for the one he had just lost. His tears were not of remorse, but of pure, undiluted self-pity, the final, selfish act of a man who had destroyed so many lives, but in the end mourned only for himself. As Sarah emerged from the dim corridor back into the harsh, fluorescent light of the main station, the world felt different. The air tasted cleaner. The oppressive weight that had been sitting on her chest for 18 years had finally, miraculously lifted. It wasn't happiness she felt, nor was it triumph. The deep, aching grief for her father remained, a scar that would never fully fade. But the toxic poison of the unknown, the suffocating burden of the town's lie, was gone. Deputy Chloe Evans stood waiting for her, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of professional concern and profound human respect. Sarah met her gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was over. The fight was won. The climax had passed, and the long, quiet work of healing could finally begin. Faced with the undeniable truth and the crushing weight of his own actions, Arthur Bishop made his choice. In the sterile, quiet room with his court-appointed lawyer, he agreed to the prosecutor's deal. The confession that followed was no longer a trickle of self-serving lies, but a floodgate of damning information, a detailed roadmap of the corruption that had festered in Cedar Creek for years. He named every accomplice: the freight company owner who fenced the stolen goods, the senior clerk at the regional sorting facility who manipulated manifests for cash, and 2 other local businessmen who helped launder the money through their legitimate enterprises. He detailed the methods, the dead-drop locations, and the financial trails with the same cold efficiency he had once applied to his mail route. It was the final, desperate act of a man trying to salvage the last few years of his life, a betrayal of his partners in crime born not of remorse, but of pure, unadulterated self-preservation. The fallout from Arthur's confession was a quiet, devastating earthquake that shook Cedar Creek to its very foundation. Over the next week, a series of pre-dawn raids conducted by a joint task force of county deputies and federal agents resulted in the arrests of 4 prominent local figures. These were not shadowy criminals, but men who coached Little League, sat on the town council, and donated to the annual bake sale. The sight of them being led from their homes in handcuffs sent a shockwave of disbelief and denial through the community. The town's carefully constructed image of itself as a safe, wholesome haven was irrevocably shattered. The whispers that had once followed Helen Miller now turned on former friends and neighbors, as the town was forced to confront the chilling reality that the evil they had ignored was not an outsider's problem, but had been living among them, smiling and waving all along. The legal process moved with a speed that was in stark contrast to the 18 years of inaction. Arthur Bishop pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and a raft of federal conspiracy charges. Standing before the judge, he was a shrunken, pathetic figure, offering a mumbled, insincere apology to the Miller family that Sarah met with a stony, unblinking stare. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, a sentence that, at his age, was a de facto guarantee he would die in prison. His detailed testimony, backed by the irrefutable financial evidence, secured swift convictions for the other members of the smuggling ring. Their sentences ranged from 7 to 15 years in federal prison for charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and trafficking stolen goods. The gavel fell not just on a group of criminals, but on an entire era of the town's corrupt, silent history. For Sarah and Helen, the verdicts were not a cause for celebration, but a moment of profound and somber finality. They sat together in the front row of the courtroom, holding hands as the sentences were read aloud. There was no triumphant release, no cathartic cheer. Instead, there was just the quiet, heavy settling of an 18-year-old weight. The legal system had provided accountability, a factual end to a story that had been defined by uncertainty, but justice could not restore what had been stolen. The true victory was not in the length of the prison sentences, but in the public restoration of Frank Miller's name. The official court record now reflected the truth they had always known. He was not a man who had abandoned his family. He was a hero who had been murdered for his integrity, a fact that finally silenced the last of the town's cruel whispers. In the aftermath, Cedar Creek was a town at war with its own memory. The convictions forced a painful public reckoning. Neighbors who had once pitied the Millers now had to confront their own complicity, their willingness to accept a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth. Friendships fractured under the weight of this new, ugly history. The narrative of Frank Miller the deserter was replaced by Frank Miller the martyr, and the town's collective guilt was a palpable, suffocating presence. Some residents became defensive, claiming they could never have known, while others offered quiet, belated apologies to Helen. The town's soul was laid bare, revealing a deep-seated fear of confronting the darkness that could hide behind a neighbor's friendly smile. The peace of Cedar Creek had been built on a foundation of willful ignorance, and that foundation had now crumbled into dust. In a formal ceremony that felt both necessary and woefully inadequate, the United States Postal Service issued a public apology to the Miller family. The Postmaster General traveled to Cedar Creek and, in a press conference held on the steps of the very post office where Frank had worked, posthumously awarded him the service's highest honor for integrity and valor. A small, polished brass plaque was installed in the lobby, its inscription simple and direct: "In memory of Frank Miller, a dedicated carrier who gave his life in the line of duty." For Sarah, seeing the plaque was a moment of bittersweet closure. It was a permanent, official testament to her father's character, a correction of the historical record that would stand long after the trials and the headlines had faded, ensuring that no one in Cedar Creek would ever be able to forget the truth again. 18 years after he disappeared into a torrential downpour, Frank Miller was finally laid to rest. The funeral was held on a gray, overcast Saturday, the sky weeping a gentle drizzle as if in sympathy. The small-town cemetery was filled to capacity, a sea of black umbrellas sheltering a community of mourners. Many were there to pay genuine respects to a man they had loved, while others seemed to be in attendance as an act of penance, seeking absolution for their years of silence. Sarah stood beside her mother, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden casket, a physical anchor in a swirling sea of complex emotions. The service was a surreal collision of past and present, a final, necessary ritual that had been denied to them for nearly 2 decades, a proper goodbye to a man whose absence had been a constant, screaming presence in their lives. When Sarah stepped up to deliver the eulogy, a hush fell over the crowd. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the damp air. She did not speak of anger or betrayal. Instead, she spoke of the man she remembered, the father who taught her to bait a hook, the husband who slow danced with his wife in the kitchen, the mail carrier who always had a smile and a pocket full of treats for the neighborhood dogs. She spoke of his simple, unwavering belief in doing the right thing, no matter how small. "My father was an ordinary man," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "But his integrity was extraordinary. The greatest lesson he taught me was that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light." Her words were not an indictment, but a gentle, powerful call to remember the cost of convenient lies. The letter, the fragile, water-stained catalyst for this entire reckoning, was sealed in an evidence bag and officially entered into the court record its purpose served. But for Sarah, it remained a sacred object, her father's final desperate message to the world. She successfully petitioned the court for a high-resolution, archival-quality photograph of it. She had it framed and placed it on the mantel in her mother's living room. It was no longer a symbol of a painful, unanswered question. It had transformed into a testament to her father's courage, a tangible piece of his final moments that was now a source of profound, sorrowful pride. It was a constant reminder that a single voice, armed with the truth, could be powerful enough to dismantle a conspiracy, even if that voice had to wait 18 years to finally be heard from beyond the grave. A few days after the funeral, as Sarah was packing her car to return to Portland, Deputy Chloe Evans stopped by the house. They stood on the front porch, the air cool and clean after the rain, sharing a moment of quiet, unspoken understanding. There were no grand speeches, just a simple acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. "Thank you," Sarah said, the words carrying a weight far beyond their simple meaning. "You listened when no one else would." Chloe just nodded, a small smile on her face. "Your father was the one who spoke up," she replied. "We just finally got around to listening." Their unlikely partnership, forged in a dusty cold case file, represented a bridge between the town's willfully blind past and a future where the truth, however painful, would no longer be so easily ignored. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but profound change began to settle over the Miller house. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Helen Miller started tending to her rose garden. She pruned the dead branches, her movements slow but deliberate, coaxing new life from the thorny, neglected stems. The oppressive cloud of shame and suspicion that had hung over her for so long had finally lifted. The grief for her husband remained, a deep and permanent ache in her heart, but it was no longer complicated by the poison of the town's judgment. She could now mourn him for who he truly was, a good man, a loving husband, a hero. The return of the roses was a quiet, beautiful symbol of her own long-dormant resilience, a sign that even after the harshest of winters, life could, and would, find a way to bloom again. Sarah's return to her life in Portland was different this time. The city no longer felt like an escape, a shield against the ghosts of her past. Cedar Creek was no longer a place of trauma, but a place where she had fought for and won the truth. The gaping wound of her father's disappearance, which had defined so much of her life, had finally closed. It left a deep and permanent scar, but it was a scar that told a story of resilience, of love, and of a daughter's unwavering refusal to let her father's memory be erased. She was no longer haunted by the question of what had happened to him. She had the answer, brutal and heartbreaking as it was. Armed with that certainty, she could finally begin to build a future that was not defined by his absence, but inspired by his legacy. On a crisp autumn afternoon, months later, Sarah drove back to Cedar Creek. She walked through the quiet cemetery, the fallen leaves crunching under her feet, until she reached her father's grave. The simple granite headstone was etched with his name and the dates of his life, and beneath them, a single line she had chosen herself: "A good man who did the right thing." She knelt and gently placed a small, sealed envelope against the cool stone. Inside was a letter she had written to him, a long, rambling message filled with everything she had wanted to tell him over the past 18 years. She told him about her life, about her mother's strength, about the fight for justice, and about how much she missed him. She stood up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. This time, the letter had reached its destination. The world did not stop for Sarah Miller. After the trials and the funeral, after the quiet apologies from neighbors, and the formal commendation from the Postal Service, life simply went on. But for her, the world was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. She had walked through the fire of her past and emerged not unscathed, but forged into something stronger. The gnawing, hollow ache of the unknown had been replaced by the solid, heavy certainty of the truth. It was a painful truth, a brutal one, but it was hers to own. The ghost that had walked beside her since she was a 10-year-old girl was finally at peace, and in that peace, Sarah found the quiet, open space to finally begin living a life that wasn't defined by a search, but by the profound and hard-won knowledge of who her father was and what he stood for. Cedar Creek became a town with a permanent scar. The story of Frank Miller and Arthur Bishop was now woven into its very identity, a modern folk tale whispered to newcomers, a cautionary lesson about the darkness that can fester beneath a placid surface. The convictions did not magically heal the community. Instead, they lanced a boil that had been poisoning it for nearly 2 decades. The illusion of small-town innocence was shattered, replaced by a more sober, more cautious understanding of human nature. People locked their doors more often. They looked at their neighbors with a new, questioning gaze. The town's collective guilt was a quiet, lingering ghost, a constant reminder that their comfortable silence had been bought at the price of one family's unbearable suffering, a debt that could never be fully repaid. The forgotten letter, once a fragile, waterlogged piece of trash, became an artifact of almost mythical status in the annals of Oregon law enforcement. It was a testament to the idea that evidence is not just what is found, but what is willing to be seen. For 18 years, it sat in its metal tomb, a silent witness waiting for a single, random act of demolition to give it a voice. Its journey from a rusted collection box to the centerpiece of a murder trial was a powerful metaphor for the persistence of truth itself. It served as a stark reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is a physical entity, leaving behind fingerprints and fragments, waiting patiently in the dark for the right person to come along and finally turn on the light. For Arthur Bishop, the rest of his life unfolded in the beige, monotonous reality of a maximum security prison. Stripped of his secrets, his money, and his meticulously crafted facade of harmlessness, he became what he had always truly been, a small, insignificant man. He was a ghost in a numbered jumpsuit, his days dictated by bells and buzzers, his only view of the world, a sliver of gray sky through a barred window. The multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise he had killed to protect was gone, his name now synonymous with pathetic, small-town evil. His ultimate punishment was not the loss of his freedom, but the utter erasure of his carefully constructed identity, leaving him with nothing but the endless, silent years to confront the memory of a good man's life he had traded for nothing. Helen Miller's Rose Garden became the talk of the neighborhood, a vibrant, defiant explosion of color against the persistent Oregon gray. In tending to the flowers, she was tending to her own soul. Each new bud was a small victory against the long winter of her grief. She could now speak of Frank, not with the tortured uncertainty of a woman whose husband was a mystery, but with the quiet, sorrowful pride of a widow whose husband was a hero. The town's judgment had been replaced by a deep, communal respect. Her survival, her quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable betrayal and loss, was the story's most profound resolution. She was the living proof that while evil can destroy a life, it can never extinguish the enduring power of love. The ripples of the Cedar Creek case extended far beyond its town limits, serving as a case study for law enforcement agencies on the critical importance of re-examining cold cases. It demonstrated how a single, overlooked piece of evidence, when viewed through a fresh set of eyes, could unravel a conspiracy that had been dormant for decades. The story became a quiet legend among detectives and prosecutors, a reminder that no case is ever truly hopeless and that justice has no expiration date. It posed a chilling and universal question. How many other secrets lie buried in shallow graves or hidden in forgotten corners, waiting for a simple twist of fate to bring them screaming into the light of day? Sarah's fight was not just for her father, but for every family that has been forced to live with the crushing weight of an unsolved crime. Her journey from a grieving daughter to a relentless champion for the truth is a testament to the power of one person's refusal to forget. It's a story that forces us to look at our own communities and wonder what secrets might be hiding behind the closed doors of our neighbors. What truths have we, as a society, agreed to ignore for the sake of comfort and convenience? What you've just heard is a story about the past refusing to stay buried, a battle that was fought and won. But it was just one story, A single letter found by chance. The story of Cedar Creek teaches us that every forgotten object, every cold case file, holds the potential for a truth that is desperately waiting to be told. And that is why our work here is so important. If you believe that these stories need to be brought into the light, please support our channel by liking this video, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss an investigation. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you think you could endure 18 years of not knowing? The truth about Frank Miller was finally uncovered, but this was just the beginning of something much larger. In the end, the story of the forgotten letter is a powerful testament to a simple, unshakable fact. The truth does not decay. It does not fade with time or wash away with the rain. It can be buried, ignored, and denied, but it cannot be destroyed. It waits with infinite patience for a crack to appear in the wall of lies built to contain it. In a quiet town like Cedar Creek, where the secrets were as deep as the surrounding forests, one daughter's love proved to be the force that could move mountains and unearth graves. Frank Miller's final message was ultimately delivered, a permanent reminder that every silence has a price, and every secret eventually comes due.